Welcome back to the With Joe Wehbe Podcast. Today, we're up to episode 40. So hooray for all of us making it this far. We're going to consolidate today because we've been talking all about how we're wired as people, why we're so messed up, and we've been talking about meaning, fulfillment, and how we kind of get those important things in our life. And the reason why I love talking about all this stuff is that no matter what we want to do, because I'm very interested and love things from education, learning, to encouraging creativity, to being more creative and continually playing myself. But the reason why I love how we're wired and love talking about the really philosophical stuff, even about meaning and all that, is because I feel like that's such an important bedrock and foundation. We're going to come in a much later episode, something called the self-awareness web. And wow, I just think that self-awareness is the ultimate gift to unlock all those doors in our life. So that's why, just to remind you why we spend so much time, but why I find it so enjoyable and interesting to be talking about all this stuff with you. So let's consolidate what we've kind of talked about so far, because we've pumped out a stack of episodes together. So it might be interesting just to go over it quickly. Now, some of the important ideas, I just had a quick look back over the episodes we've done so far and had to think about, what's really interesting and worth pointing at and noting at this point in time. So I think one of the most important ideas, especially important idea that most people don't really engage with or realize the importance of in their day-to-day lives, is the point that we're very homeostatic when it comes to our pleasure. So if you remember, that's when we were talking about how we kind of have a baseline as people. And when we have a pleasure experience, we tend to come back to that baseline after. So an Olympian who wins gold will come back to baseline, 1 or 2 weeks after, and there's lots of conversations about this in public, right? Because it's just a momentary pleasure. It doesn't last. So we talked about homeostasis and the pleasure treadmill in episodes 14 and 15, 014 and 015. And to me, that is one of the most important things to fundamentally understand about ourselves, that we come back to a baseline. The other thing I think is crucial was stuff about the happiness curve and the expectations gap specifically. So if you remember, that was probably around, what have I got there? I think around episode 29, we started talking about the expectations gap. We spent a bit talking about that. That's the idea that so much of our damage we do, especially in Western cultures where we have very materially rich and opportunity rich society and environments, that we have the kind of twin-edged sword of achievement and aspiration and ambition. And we have all these expectations about what our life could, or rather should be. But really, sometimes the only problem is just having high expectations about things. Unhealthily high expectations. So we talked about that expectations gap as probably a really big explanation, probably causally, around why we tend to have this happiness curve in life, why young people and then middle-aged people are not as happy as older people who've kind of figured it all out. So it's always, I had the joke of accelerating midlife crisis for that reason. Also, I think one of the important principles, so we've talked about there, that we're homeostatic, that we come back to a baseline after a pleasure experience. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, they don't make us ongoing happy for a long period of time, but a short period of time, so that that's by our biology's way of continually motivating behaviors it thinks are going to help us boost our survival and genetic furthering odds, right? The expectations gap, right? We have an expectation of what our lives will be, often very hard to live up to. The third idea I think is really important is what we talked about, the widening gap. We used the metaphor, I believe it was, what have I got? Episode 23, the widening gap. I think we used the metaphor of two business partners, or, two companies, natural selection. We talked about humanity and our cognitive revolution, how we kind of disrupted the whole natural order of things when we started to play beyond the rules of the initial game, we start to be able to manipulate more of natural selection and stop that being a dominant force in our lives, or that's one way of interpreting it anyway. So I think that idea is very important, because what that relates to, what we discussed there, if you remember, if you caught those episodes, was that basically the world we live in gets more and more complex, and it changes and advances at a compounding rate. So it gets faster and faster and faster. It's the rate of change. The ultimate metaphor is the phone. Look how much phones change in these days in 2020 compared to how slow the phone came to evolve relatively 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. The contrast though is that inside in our experience in our brains, our minds, we're not evolving that quickly. We can only manually update our brain. A good portion of our brain is pre-wired, but and wired to behave in certain ways. But then we have this cognitive conscious part that's ours to play with. We can try and upskill that as much as possible, though we can't evolve as quickly as humans as we can manipulate the technology and content of our environment. That can be broken down further, but we just don't want to overcomplicate that idea. The problem with that is that we were not, our minds and our bodies, when I talk about we've subverted natural selection in a way, or superseded it, we don't really evolve at that rate that helps us deal with modern life. We're not very well equipped to survive in some of our most materially rich and comfortable environments for that reason. It's a huge disconnect, right? I had a joke on one of the podcasts that if there was an instruction manual for our brain when it was designed, it would be, keep in tribes of 30 or 40 people, keep in a green area because it responds well to that natural environment, right? Men more predisposed to hunting, women to nurturing and gathering. And, if you look at how we were designed, we're kind of misusing the technology, but in this case, the technology would be us in that metaphor. So if thinking about the combination of those three things, a fourth idea I want to consolidate and hark back to is actually what we started this whole series with on episode 11, which was Astro the dog. We spent three episodes initially talking about Astro. And that, to me, if I want to consolidate a lot of this, it's harking back to that metaphor of Astro the dog that controls our brain. Personally, more than anything, I find that the easiest single metaphor to try and keep top of mind to consolidate all the ideas we've talked about in terms of expectations gap, pleasure treadmill, homeostasis, all those things. Keeping in mind that there's this dog that runs 90% of our brain and has 90% of our knowledge, though is poorly suited to understanding our environment, to looking around, seeing what's happening around us in the world and trying to make sense of it. Imagine how much of our world makes sense to a dog. It slowly adapts to the reality that it lives in a house, right? That it's going to work, that it's achieving things. But our lives would look very funny through a dog's eyes rather. So I keep that metaphor in mind as often as possible, just because it's a very tangible thing that helps keep that perspective. So that's consolidating where I think we've gone so far, in the hope of making it easier to go forward. The other thing is, I've noticed that obviously, as this is still a daily podcast at this point in time, some people have been finding it useful to consume at certain times of their day. So I thought I'd share some of those because, I'm here, I'm available for you. Whether you're having a shower in the morning, I'm happy to join you for that shower. When you go and do your number 2, at breakfast, on the commute to work, on the walk or on the car trip or on the train or on the bus. Just because these episodes are so kind of short and small, but obviously we're trying to distill, kind of big important ideas and add them one at a time I just thought it'd be interesting to explore. That's some of the ways that people are consuming the podcast. So that might give you an idea, if this serves you, how you can make it more sustainable and easy for yourself to kind of listen. Because let's face it, guys, at 10 minutes a day, 10 minutes of Joe is probably, I guess that can be pushing it. It can be a bit intense and much to bear. But if there's useful stuff in here for you, that's probably not the end of the world, especially if you're listening and you can just slot it seamlessly into your day. Apart from that, just remember the normal logistics. These are all kind of designed in order. So if you do get interested, I recommend going back to the very start of the podcast to kind of listen all the way through. But apart from that, just want to thank you for joining us once again. We will keep trucking on into the deep, dark web of self-awareness and learning more about ourselves and wiring and whatnot. But just remember always to keep in mind, whether it's sharing this or sharing the lessons or living the lessons to benefit other people around you, to keep opening doors for other people in your world. Because the best way to open 1,000 doors for you is to concentrate on opening doors for others. Thank you.